since I'm competing with General Morrison and lunch, it's good to have such a wonderful crowd. Thank you very much for coming. My company is Trusted Systems, and we're involved in physical security of network applications. And what we're going to talk about today is the concept of how this evolved and how you integrate physical security and cybersecurity. The biggest challenge we face is that, for the most part, physical security has been pretty much ignored. They assume the facility is secured, so they then just work on cyber, they work on equipment and other things. And what we're going to talk about today is a concept that looks at the endpoint in its entirety to see how we can secure the network going forward. Now, turns out that in the program for the CompTIA security, the topics that we are going to be reviewing today pretty much are labeled up here from the standpoint that we're not looking at necessarily physical security in and of itself. You're looking at network security, and everything's tied to the network now, and that's why it's important. Second thing is we have to look at the compliance, operational security, OPSEC issues that many times aren't integrated in well with either the hardware side of things or the cyber side, and they all need to work together. Then from that, we start looking at the threats and the vulnerabilities. From that, we will look at how it's impacted through the network and the hosting and applications. And then one of the things that we're going to focus on is how you can integrate access control and identity management into the physical security model to make this a integrated point-to-point, end-to-end solution. And then last, we'll touch a little bit on cryptography, but that's pretty much, as you'll see, integrated in. There's type 1 crypto, and then there's CSFC that's been coming online, so that's had some impact as well. But the whole idea is that we are going to relate this to the physical security at the endpoint. Now, we start looking at the problem. The biggest threat that we saw going forward, and this has been evolving over years and years, ever since the internet came along, of the insider threat. And a couple of comments I'll make here about how this has evolved. First of all, cybersecurity in and of itself works from the inside out. And what we're looking at is that physical security, though, has always been a facility-based solution or room-based, and that is stopping at the wall of the facility. And it leaves a vulnerability because network equipment is left exposed inside the room. You can be cleared, you can be in the room, but the network equipment is exposed to the insider predominantly. Unfortunately, there is no policy, because we're in a highly regulated environment, there is no policy that covers from the wall to the desktop when you're in the room. And that's whether you're in any kind of a cleared facility or in an actual SCIF itself. So that leaves plenty of room for the insider threat. And I give you Bradley, now Chelsea Manning, and Edward Snowden. And they were able to take advantage of that loophole and got away with the farm, as many of you know. Here you are sitting in Hawaii in a perfectly cleared SCIF in a cave, and you are having a perfectly cleared guy inside, and yet because the network equipment in the SCIF was exposed, thumb drives and whatever, they were able to get away with the farm. And that's what we're going to talk about today in terms of coming up with a solution that will address that issue directly. Now, part of the problem is you have opposing cultures between the IT world and the physical security world. You have the C4I world, and I kind of define the physical security realm as G3D. Government loves acronyms, so I made up my own. G3D stands for guns, gates, guards, and dogs, okay? And there you come up with the inherent conflict. Now, the fact that because we're in opposing cultures, there are basic areas of conflict that exist. One is that, of course, the IT world is very dynamic. The physical security world is very static. That you also have the IT world, of course, is driven by technology, and the physical security is tied to the facility. You also have, of course, technology moving at the speed of light, and physical security moves at the speed of a glacier. The other side is that because IT and cybersecurity dominates the landscape and dominates the funding and all the attention and manpower, the physical security becomes an afterthought. It's been assumed it's there and it's accepted, so all the attention gets paid towards the IT end of things. And that becomes a problem because the physical security is in a tangible environment. Obviously, IT is in the virtual environment. And because it's virtual, that means that the intelligence of a computer can be used both for you and against you. And that's where you run into the problem. Now, the other thing that's involved is that the IT world is online. And the physical security environment and the people who manage it and control it are always looking for offline storage. In a network environment, that's the kiss of death. And that becomes a real challenge to how to make this work together. The IT people, of course, want everybody to see everything all the time, and the physical security guys, and I run into them all the time, don't want anybody to see anything ever. So there's the conundrum. Now, one of my favorite American philosophers is Yogi Berra. And since we have these two forks, he was famous for saying, when you come to a fork in the road, take it. And that's what we're doing here. We're looking at how do we blend and integrate physical and cyber security together. Now, cyber works through the network. Physical, of course, works around it. But cyber has an inherent weakness in the fact that it's reactive. It's waiting for the next attack. And physical security is proactive. So physical security deals with certainty. The cyber world deals with uncertainty. It's basically playing what I call cyber chess. You're waiting for the next move. And you're always trying to anticipate it, but it becomes a real issue. The only way that you can work is they have to work in unison together. And that's what we're going to spend our time today talking about. Now, when you look at the endpoint and you look at security, whether it's IT or cybersecurity or physical security, the heart of the problem is always people. You can't use the word always very often. But in this case, when it comes to security, you can. And because of that, it makes the endpoint very vulnerable. And since there's been very little attention paid to the physical security side, on the cybersecurity side is only covering half the thing. It's like clapping with one hand. You can't get the job done there. But if you apply physical security along with access control that's proactive, that prevents people from having access to network equipment rather than the network, you now have an opportunity to solve that problem, because now you can counter the threat from the outside in as well as cyber does from the inside out. Now, I want to go back a little bit because there was a real sea change in technology that occurred around 1990. And what happened is the identity and function of what was a traditional SCIF changed. Before that, and I was an early VAR with Sun Microsystems in the middle 80s, so we saw the transformation of going from mainframe computing, batch computing, to distributed network computing. And in fact, their motto was always is, the computer is the network. And so when you have that thinking, the software, you had the trusted criteria, all looked at that from a network inside-out perspective, but the physical security people really didn't. And so after about 1990, where we saw a number of things happening. First of all, the internet pretty much changed everything. We went to the World Wide Web. It started out, of course, with the ARPANET in the 80s and then moved into the internet after that. But also, the threats changed as well, because you went from the bipolar Big Bear threat of the Soviet Union, having the wall come down. You now had asymmetric threats and terrorism on the rise. And then when you started having distributed networks, the access points to the network were not just within a closed area or a SCIF, it was everywhere. Every user became an access point to the network. So the hackers of the world could explode. And as distributed computing exploded, so did the vulnerabilities. But the most important thing that happened from a physical security point of view and a definition point of view is that SCIFs became a network portal. Everything wasn't done inside the SCIF, but even though you had a SCIF and you were cleared to be in it, the data wasn't stored there anymore. You were really a network portal to the cloud. Called it the gig back then. They had all kinds of different names for it, but it fundamentally was the cloud. And that was not recognized by the physical security folks because their policies stayed the same. Secondarily, the desktop at the endpoint where the user interface to the network exists, the access point to the network, hadn't changed either. Now you've added VTC terminals and voice over IP phones, and you got flat screen displays instead of the old cathode tube displays. But fundamentally, the user interface to the network hasn't changed that much. Even when you get into zero clients or virtual desktops, there still is a keyboard, monitor, and mouse. Now, I want to differentiate a little bit from the standpoint that mobility has added a whole new wrinkle into this equation. So when you're dealing with tablets and portability, that becomes a different challenge. But what we're going to talk about here is basically the desktop environment and how do we solve that problem first. We have some solutions we're working on for the mobile environment, but fundamentally that actually takes the whole vulnerability of the human interface to the network to a new level when they can walk around with an iPad anywhere they want. And that becomes a different kind of a challenge, but we're not going to talk about that here today. Now, of course, as the networks expand, the vulnerability at the endpoint expands. So when we started looking at, and I've been at this since about 1986, so it's taken me 32 years to be an overnight success, right? So here I am, still here. But the whole point is that over that time period, as technology has advanced, the threat environment has advanced, and the vulnerabilities that we have advanced, that the fundamental problems and the issues and the objectives stay fundamentally the same, but they've been evolving. So a lot of this is done by trial and error. And you put something out there, see how it works, you get a lot of input from a lot of different people, and it makes a lot of sense as to how this thing evolves so that it can be basically independent of technology and hardware, but would be a solution that would enable you to advance the state of the art from technology, but not be able to push it where a physical security solution can't be applied to it. So, the big objective is you want to secure the network hardware, not just the space. You also want to emphasize online operation. The best way to have a stable network is to keep it online all the time. When you go on and offline, you have hardware power-up problems. You have all kinds of issues with getting on and offline and having to store devices and get things up and running. And then, of course, you have the famous Sipper Tuesday scenario. Once you get online, then you have to wait to be able to use the network, say, in the Sipper world. But also, the important thing is you want to tie, particularly the physical security, to the network, not to the facility. And that becomes important because networks are always expanding, always changing, always upgrading or moving. And so you need to have a physical security that's tied to the network, not to the building it's in, because then it becomes an anchor. And the next thing is you want to be able to have a security solution that migrates from the desktop to the cloud so that it's a seamless security solution that regardless of the technology, regardless of the hardware you're using, regardless of the topology of the network itself, you're able to have it work smoothly and have consistent security throughout. The idea is to bring the network out to you instead of making you go to the network, because now you got to go into SCIFs, you've got to log in, you've got to then get online, get offline. Here we want to have something that's online all the time and readily available. And it also has to be viewed from multiple perspectives. What do I mean by that? First of all, you have to look at the user himself and how he interacts with the network. You have to look at the information assurance requirements. You have to look at the network manager. How does it affect network performance, bandwidth? And then you have to look at the facility, the physical security managers as well. And so you need to come up with a solution that allows you to look through the prism of all these different perspectives. And so that's the objectives of what we're looking at. Now, when we look at where we've been, the traditional countermeasures in the physical security world fall quite short, and they're getting further and further behind because they haven't changed much. First, of course, SCIFs, CAAs, OSS, open secret storage, closed access areas, are all related to securing the space. Once you're inside the wall, once you're inside the door, it's Katie bar the door. You can do whatever you want. The second thing is that when you go from SCIF to SCIF or cleared area to cleared area, they have things called PDS, which is a protective distribution system, and that's the conduit and the whole maze of wiring that has to be distributed throughout a building. The problem with it, it's fixed, it's permanent, and you can't change it. And one thing you can be certain of that is always changing is the network. And that is something you have to adapt to. And the third is, the only thing they had available at the endpoint was the famous GSA storage containers. And they haven't changed in 40 years. In fact, they were originally invented by Eisenhower in the 50s. And they literally have stayed the same. Now the locks are better, they're electronic. The steel has gotten stronger, it's hard plate now, but other than that, it's been the same. And this is what kind of a diagram of a SCIF configuration would look like. What I want you to pay attention to is the endpoint, because it's a mess. It can be any number of things. You're dealing with, as I said, we're now in the desktop world where you're adding multimedia environments. You are adding with VTC, voice over IP phone. You're now looking at laptops, desktops, notebooks, tablets, all kinds of computing power available to you. And everything, when you're in a SCIF environment, is funneled through a junction box and the PDS into either a comm closet or a SCIF or some type of a data center. And everything is then relegated to offline storage. And that's been the paradigm that's been out there for years. It's going to take quite a bit to change it. But if we look at then the endpoint itself, there are a couple things that become important. Number one is you want functional simplicity. Whatever you do, you want to keep it simple, stupid. You want the KISS treatment, because you're dealing with people and you want to make sure that the processes are not only robust and actually define a specific behavior that you require, but it's also convenient, so they're going to be willing to comply. If you make it too complex, they just do workarounds as best they can. The second thing is you want an environment that's going to be flexible. It's got to be adaptable to the network, everything from single user to small clusters of users to bullpen areas that need to have the same level and type of security, but it's got to be adaptable. The other thing along with that is it has to be self-contained, because if you're going to be able to move this and you want to have modularity so that it can adapt with the network, you want to be able to have it self-contained so it can be moved wherever the network moves. Once you marry it to the network, you now have the ability of being able to scale it as well as to be able to relocate it. From that, since it is self-contained, there has to be built-in reliability. If you're going to be online all the time, it's got to run well and run for a long period of time. It's been proven that from a hardware reliability point of view, that if you keep computer systems on and running 24/7 and you don't power down and up every day, you literally get a 3 to 5 year improvement in hardware reliability that we've measured and seen time and again, rather than the power cycling that creates the spikes that affect electronics. And this has been something that a lot of people don't pay attention to, but if you don't have to replace your PC or hardware every year, you can do it every 3 or 4 years. It just makes the network and the operation more stable, and it also makes it more cost-effective as well. The other thing that's important is that, as I said before, we want to bring the network to you instead of making you go to the network. The important thing is to have real-time availability, and I want to emphasize the term real-time, because now when you're making decisions, our example here is going to talk mostly about SIPRnet on the secret level. When you have decisions that have to be made, you've got UAVs up in the air, you've got battle plans, you've got imagery coming down from a satellite. You're in a real-time warfighter environment. Decisions have to be made quickly. So the availability to the network to get on and off, and the higher you go up the command chain, the more important that becomes. Time becomes a real important factor. And the last thing is it needs to be affordable. You want to have something that's going to last. You want to have something that's going to be expandable and flexible wherever you're located and doesn't obsolete itself. Now, the solution, one of them that has worked, and the one I've been involved with, is called a IPS security container. GSA came up with this, had to get it regulated and approved by them, but they came up with the term IPS, which stands for Information Processing System Security Container. Quite a mouthful, as only GSA could provide. And we just call it an IPS container for short. And it's been out now and approved since about 1992. So it's been around ever since distributed computing has been around, and it has evolved with that. And we're going to show you some of those solutions that have come into play. But the main thing is we took a storage container and we basically made an armored computer cabinet out of it so that you could provide cooling inside. You had a convenient rack system for mounting equipment, maintaining equipment, secure way of getting cables, both power and data, in and out of the unit. And that's basically what an IPS container is. Now, the solution, and it's now been in fact accepted by DISA, is that it is now a CAA all by itself. So it can stand alone in an open area and do SIPRnet as an example. That's a big step forward because it aids a lot in terms of flexibility. Secondly, it runs closed door and unattended so that it can run by itself and you don't need to have a lot of manpower for support. The other thing is that it is scalable so that it can meet either a single user application or it can be in an open bullpen area or others. Welcome. Thank you. Now, in looking at the IPS container itself, the first thing we had to do is to deal with the legacy environment that was out there. And that had to do with the SCIFs and the PDS and the Dropboxes and everything that you all came to know and love. And so we have adapted the IPS container to that environment so that we could basically provide an alternative within a PDS structured environment. The other thing is at the higher end, we wanted to integrate it into an office environment so that you could combine a workstation, a desk, and the safe into one functional piece of cabinetry that could allow you to take up the least amount of space possible. The other thing that happened along the way is we started getting up, and we're now addressing the JWICS world as well. So we're looking at IPS containers that can handle NIPR, SIPR, it can handle coalition networks, Centrics, BICES as an example, and also to be able to look at the JWICS world, which is real difficult right now because it's the price of entry is about $500,000. You have to build a SCIF to use it. And trying to get DIA to consider it as either a T-SCIF or as an alternative has become a real challenge. The first step in doing that is being able to have a tempested IPS container so that you cover both the physical security, the environmental security, but you also have tempested hardware. And along the way, when we did that, it was about 2004, I became aware of something called an electromagnetic pulse. In fact, there was a talk on it yesterday afternoon that told you a little bit about the two sources of EMP. One is a high-altitude nuclear detonation. The other is a coronal mass ejection from the sun. One is obviously a function of rogue nations and the political landscape we're in, or the geopolitical landscape. The other is something we can't control. It's the sun. And it can happen anytime. The last one, major one, was in 1859 called the Carrington event. We had a near miss in 2012 that was that size that missed our orbit by 1 week. And that would have wiped out all our electronics and the power grid. It's a subject for another day. But one of the things we felt important was that along with the Tempest hardware solution of keeping emanations in, we can also keep electromagnetic pulses out. So at least for control systems, what they call SCADA systems, as well as any networked environment, you can actually provide a secure base so that you could survive an EMP attack. Now, just to go through what they look like, here is a family of IPS containers from small to large. The key to it is actually having a flexible design that allows it to scale, and we can structure basically the size of the container to the application and the user environment. The second thing then is what is now an integrated Dropbox, which basically instead of having to go into the safe, DISA has made it important now that you have to secure all the network switches. But in and of that by itself doesn't solve the problem, because it only secures the switch. It doesn't secure the user interface to the switch at all the nodes that it connects to. So this is a solution that works where you basically take a patch panel, mount it in a junction box, and put it into a PDS or a safe environment so that you can actually have the switch on and running inside of the safe, and you can then connect to it just like you used to. But again, you're still dealing with offline storage. You got to pull a hard drive out of a safe, you got to pull a crypto key out, you've got to do all this other stuff. And this at least is a step forward to integrate the IPS container into that existing world. Here's an example of an integrated office suite. This is at the high end. We have down in our exhibit space a sample of this on display. And the importance of having this integrated into the office environment is, first of all, it conceals the fact that you have a classified presence. If you're in a mixed use, mixed domain environment where you're normally not classified, say in a classroom or a conference room, but then you have to go classified, well, you can use this, which would conceal it, and then be able to integrate it into a classified session without people even knowing that the classified connectivity is there. It also offers a tremendous amount, particularly for general officer quarters and high-profile offices. It offers a tremendous advantage in terms of convenience and access. Again, you're now getting real-time availability of all your networks at the desktop. They don't have to run to a SCIF. They don't have to run to somewhere else in order to get access to the network. That real-time availability at the endpoint is becoming one of the driving forces of this business. This is what a Tempest or EMP hardened enclosure would look like, where you could actually have a Tempest shell mounted inside of the physical security containers. So you're having basically security in depth. And that way you have the ability of providing both the physical security that's mandated by GSA and others, but you also have the Tempest security to enable you to provide that higher end level of protection. And it's whether it's a Tempest or it's an EMP threat, it's an integrated product. It still has the self-contained, reliable modularity. Now, comparing SCIFs and the IPS container really quick. One is fixed and permanent, the other is self-contained. One protects space, the other protects equipment. The SCIF is expensive. Once it's there, it's not only expensive, but it's permanent as well. The IPS container is cost-effective because it's movable and it's non-obsolescent. In fact, we still have some safes. First ones I did in Europe are still up and running there. I sold those in 1993, and they're still up and running. The equipment changed, the networks changed, but the security did not. The fact that when you're in a SCIF and a build-out, if you have to move, you have to change, you got to rebuild the whole thing. The timelines take you then up to a year to rebuild a SCIF. You guys who are involved in the SIPR world probably know more about that than I do. But the modularity of a self-contained, what we call a SCIF in a box, is something that gives you that functionality and security, but it also gives you, I don't want to say mobility, because these safes weigh anywhere from 400 to 2,500 pounds. But let's say it's forkliftable at least. But it does give you transportability. The other thing is that where you're not attached to the facility, you're attached to the network, and that you now can control the user interface effectively so you can minimize human intervention in the process. When you're dealing with SCIFs, you're dealing with build-outs of any kind, it's always manpower intensive. You've got to have inspections. You've got to have processes of controlling locks and controlling doors and people. And so the whole labyrinth, everything from the users to the techs to the security officers, all become more actively involved in the physical security, where the network is just expanding like crazy, and it becomes more and more difficult to control. The other thing I want to touch on is now we're going to get to the endpoint. And that is where you have where the user is. Big challenge with, of course, a SCIF is everybody's in the room. You can kind of control them. They're there. But when you're outside of a room and you're dealing with a SCIF in a box, kind of a modularity, the user is actually outside. And so we're going to talk about that next. Because when you look at an IPS container as it evolved, by itself doesn't really solve the problem. It gives you a platform to build a solution, but it's not network-centric by itself. And what it requires is the ability of looking at access controls. One that controls the user interface at the front end to the network, And the second thing is the network interface itself, how you actually can protect and monitor the equipment. And so that at the back end, you have that network security solved. And that's the only way you're going to be able to get a seamless user to the cloud solution. And with that in mind, here's what has been developed. First of all, looking at the desktop. One thing that we've done is to come up with a supplemental access control mechanism that controls only one thing. It controls the keyboard, monitor, mouse on the desktop, or a VTC terminal or voice over IP phone. Because if you can control that, you're not interfering with the network, you're not dealing with network traffic, you're not getting involved with your SIPR token, you're dealing with only toggling on and off the desktop, which is that user interface to the network. And because it is supplemental to your SIPR token logon, you now have 4-factor authentication instead of 2. But one is local. It's embedded within the safe itself, so it's locally controlled. It's not on the Active Directory. It's not, you don't have a revocation list. It's the local security officer that controls it. The other, of course, SIPR is on the Active Directory, but this complements that. The second thing is you have people involved. And one of the things that would happen if you have the screen up and running outside, what do you do to control, to keep the user there and available so that he doesn't stand up and walk away? And one thing that we've developed was a motion sensor. If the guy's got a pulse, he can stay online. If he doesn't, you got bigger problems. But if you have the ability of monitoring his activity, he has a control space of like 15 feet, I believe, around that workstation that the user is responsible for. And so if he stands up and leaves him on connect, say, oh, I'm just going to go down the hall, I want to go get a quick lunch, I need to go to the restroom or whatever, that he needs to log off and log on. We make it simple. We try to keep it simple, but in fact, I'm kind of reminded of the Geico ad, so simple even a caveman can do it. But the problem is when you make it simple and convenient, they then want to make exception to it. And so they'll get up and walk off because it's so easy to do. With the motion sensor, that automatically would cut the screen off and they would have to re-log on. Of course, it's a violation if they get up and walk away and leave their SIPR token in and working, as well as the screen up and running. So that becomes an issue. Now, the other thing that we see here is the network devices need to stay online and operational in the safe all the time. So let's take a SIPR example. The SIPR laptop with its hard drive on and running all the time. The crypto key is in and running online all the time. And as well as your switch, routers, whatever other comm gear or storage devices you might have. So now you have a very stable working environment. But the value is you get rid of what they affectionately call SIPR Tuesdays. You don't have to run around throughout the building and have to turn on your laptops every week when Microsoft comes up with their latest patches and DISA will distribute them. You can leave it online. Why? Because the SIPR PC is on and running and automatically gets the patches downloaded, so it's immediately available. Remember that wording, real time again. You now have real-time SIPR connectivity that's instant. And that gives you a real advantage from an operational and a network stability point of view, as well as an availability and access point of view. The fact that it's inside the safe means it's air-gapped. No one can get at it. You either know the combo to the safe or you're not getting in. And the whole point is that the user is now only having access to the network through the desktop. He has no access to network equipment, which now complies with the latest DISA STIG that only requires admin personnel to have access to network devices. And this way you eliminate that from the user. So therefore the user doesn't even have to have the combo to the safe. They just need to have the CAC and PIN to do their local two-factor authentication. And, of course, their SIPR token and logon, and that's all they need. And that's whether you're a private or a general. So it gives that parity of security that can transcend whatever type of network or wherever you're located. And that's one of the most important aspects of that. But they don't have access to the equipment itself. This is an example. In fact, this is what's down on the show floor, where we actually have a desktop reader for CAC and PIN that's sit next to the keyboard, and then a controller and a tablet inside the safe that actually manages the access control, which the local security authority is the one who programs. So he will enroll what users are accessible to that particular site. And then it goes from there to an authentication mode where once you close the safe, you leave it closed. Of course, you don't have that many openings of the lock. The reliability of the lock is enhanced, and the exposure of that network equipment is greatly reduced. Now, the second side is the back end of this, on the network side. How do you secure the network equipment in an effective way? Now, up till now in a SCIF, when you have equipment in a SCIF, you aren't securing that equipment, you're securing the SCIF itself with an IDS system, an intrusion detection system that monitors the door and the lock, or the access. But when we take that and we shrink the SCIF down into an IPS container, a SCIF in a box solution, you need to have an alternative to that. But because you also are only focusing on equipment, you have to do something more. So what's been done is that we took an basically a smart PDU, which monitors temperature and power, and you can find it in any computer cabinet. It's a standard product. And we enhanced it, because now we're concerned with one thing, the lock and the door of the safe. Because the hard plate of the safe is you can't drill it. So the exposure and the vulnerability, again, talking about the insider threat, is the guy who knows the combo to the safe. You want to be able to control his activity. Or if someone's trying to hack it, or someone trying to, do the little stethoscope thing or try to get it working to the, whoops, how did that go south on me here? There we go. You now have the need to have to monitor the lock and the door of the safe itself. So, the other thing is, because it's an IDS, you don't want it integrated into the packets within the network traffic, because then you get into all the network performance monitoring access that you need to be able to control. You want to keep it separate. Just like your IDS system, your alarm system is always separate. This has to be the same way. And also, that what you want to do is that you want to monitor not only the environmentals, because you have to also look at the power, if you have a power outage, or overheating. You want to be able to monitor that. That's important. But let's talk about the lock and the door for a minute. Now, the way this works effectively is, first of all, like a SCIF, you want to be able to monitor the door, whether it's open or closed. And that basically is using an SNMP trap technology. Do you all know what that means? It's basically an alarm signal that can be sent over the internet that will indicate an alert or an alarm condition. And that protocol is fairly industry standard. And if you have network performance monitoring tools, like from HP, they have OpenView, Spectrum is from CA, SolarWinds has Orion, that you want to be able to integrate into that network performance monitoring setup, which is normally at a dispatch center, normally in a NOC, or some type of a security office so that it can be monitored. You need to integrate this into that, because you are part of the facility, you're just an autonomous part of the facility. And so what you want to do is you want to look at the lock. And because we manufacture this safe and we have to install and support the lock, we came up with a mechanism of monitoring two things. One is you want to monitor the lock position. one of the biggest problems with locks that you have is that you have a issue with closing the door, but if you don't turn the spin dial, it's not locked. So you can close the safe, and until we came up with that solution, a lot of people were saying, ooh, that's a real problem, but we didn't want to tell anybody because it kind of let the cat out of the bag. So people would come back in the next day and say, oops. But in that environment, you want to be able to control the fact that the safe is locked as well as being closed. The last thing, which determines, which is the real magic sauce of this, is you want to be able to control the rotation of the spin dial. Because if you can monitor that, then anybody who's entering a combo becomes a threat. Remember now, the user doesn't have to get into the safe. In fact, is not allowed to get into the safe. So the only people getting in are the authorized techs for maintenance or diagnostics or in installation, and a bad guy or gal. And so the real key here is coming up with a means of being able to determine in a simple way, again, we're talking functional simplicity, of being able to detect that. So all we care about is who's turning that spin dial. We don't care if they're in the room. We don't care who they are. We don't care if they even know the combo to the safe. Doesn't make any difference. The most important thing is that they are turning that spin dial. And if it's at off hours, like 11 at night, or was someone like an Edward Snowden trying to break in to connect again to some other portal or some other network database somewhere, you need to detect that. Detecting the spin dial rotation gives you that. And so that's the third parameter that's used in this monitor and control system. And then that alert, whether it's a spin dial turning or others, can then allow you can either send it through a text message or an email, or this SNMP trap going into the NOC. You can then send it out and be able to respond. Now, alarms. Alarms don't solve anything. They don't protect anything at all. They just give you an indication something's wrong. It's like the engine warning light on your car. It can be anything from a small ECV valve to your oil's dead and gone and your engine's going to blow up in about 5 minutes. You don't know. So having an alert doesn't protect anything. In fact, in the environment today with an IDS system, you call the guard, they have 10 to 15 minutes to respond. Well, an insider threat's going to know that. He can get in and out and do a lot of damage in that time frame. So the real key here is being able to provide a response to that. And like with these smart PDUs, what do they control? They control power. They have the ability of sending SNMP signals back to the unit to basically shut the hardware down instantly. So now you imagine you have a continuous monitor now of the lock and the door of the safe itself. And if somebody turns even a quarter of a turn of a spin dial at an unauthorized time and they're an unauthorized person, you now have the ability of having someone in a dispatch center or a guard station, wherever they are, to have them be able to respond by instantly shutting everything down. Here's a diagram of what that looks like. So what happens is, when you shut everything down, that means the laptop or PC is shut down. In fact, you even have time, because it takes you almost a minute to enter the combo, that you have time to even zeroize the index or scrub it to ones and zeros. You can do some things to the hard drive to try to save it. You can also zeroize the crypto, because there's a power off sequence that they have on the TAC lanes that allow you to do that, so that you could even send a remote command to zeroize the crypto, turn off the laptop, turn off the switch, the network connection is now dead, and when they get in, they get nothing. They get hardware, right. And they can start pulling things out if they choose to do so, but they better do it in 10 minutes or less. You're exactly right, sir. And now you have control of the complete environment. And it's something that you're now minimizing the human intervention. You're now maximizing the ability of controlling the access to the network. The user access to the network with the desktop access controls, and now the safe access to the network equipment. You do both, you now have a complete user to the cloud solution that allows you to, let's see, this isn't advancing here, what's going on? Oh, here we go. Sorry about that, cockpit error here. So, wrapping this up a bit, you're now able to secure the network hardware, not just the room. You have online, unattended operation, not offline storage. You don't have to rely on it. Your security is now tied to the network, not the facility. The user network access is only access to the network, but not the network hardware. The remote monitor and control system now gives you control of the hardware itself and the power to it. And now you have seamless endpoint security from the user to the cloud. However, policy's an issue. Going back to Yogi Berra, he had another phrase I just came across, which was interesting. This guy had really an amazing mind about how to put words together. He said, when it comes to policy, there is no difference between policy and practice. When it comes to practice, there is. And that's exactly what we have. Because the policies are always lagging behind technology and the threats. And that's the biggest problem we have. Right now, you can look at the acronyms here of all the different specs that we have. You have the ICD 705 spec for the SCIFs. You have the CNSSI 7003, which is the PDS spec, and then you have the IPS Container spec itself. By the way, they all don't reference each other. They're all stovepiped. So they're all looked at in a vertical vacuum, if you will, not looking at the whole or a contiguous, holistic kind of a solution. And so therefore, what it comes down to is the local accrediting authority is the person who's now accountable for either meeting the CCRI accreditation and compliance or coming up with taking a risk. Now, it's kind of easy when you're a 4-star general and you have like a integrated safe in his office. He can actually be that authority. But for everybody else, the poor security guy, the IA team, physical together become the authority that have to make a calculated decision. And the problem is, with limited guidance, it's open to a wide variety of interpretation. And you have some people saying, well, we can leave our TAC lane out on the desktop and just pull the key out and put it in a safe. No problem. Now we can secure the switch. They haven't secured the endpoint, and it's still a control device, but they haven't secured, they've secured the switch, so they kind of met the intent of what was written, but it doesn't solve the problem. And so that becomes an issue. Now, the disastig itself, here's what it says. Just a lot of words here, and I tried to blow it up on the screen as large so you could read it. This disastig was very important, and DISA actually has become the real reigning authority in this because they actually own and run CIPRNet. And they first of all acknowledge that the IPS container is a CAA by itself, which is very important. Up till a few years ago, that was not the case. But that's important. However, the second check is the one that matters, and that is that only network administrators, other authorized personnel can have access to network connections. And so now the users are not supposed to have access to that switch, not supposed to have access to patch panels, USB ports, laptops, whatever. And so this STIG is what's causing all the heartaches for people trying to get a CCRI. In fact, we're working with McCord Air Force Base right now, and they came in for their CCRI inspections, and they shut half the base down because they couldn't comply until they come up with a solution, which we're working with them on. But this is a serious problem because that's the vulnerability to the insider threat that they're now starting to address. But now the problem is the whole, the whole network environment out there has to now comply. And that becomes an issue. The only other thing that they came up with, again, which was very vague, was a statement that said terminal equipment, desktop terminal equipment, this is stuff that's attached to a Dropbox in a PDS environment, must be safeguarded to prevent tampering. Now, what in God's name does that mean? You know, how do you define it? How do you quantify it? That's an issue, you know, we have to work on. And so that's the only guidance that the local accrediting authority has been given. So, a couple of recommendations and then we'll wrap up here. First of all, when you're having a network running 24/7, use the latest hardware. Many times people go into their cage where they have all their old keyboards, monitors, and mice, and PCs, and laptops, and they pull out whatever they can and kludge it together. You need to have extended long-term hardware reliability. Going with laptops or notebooks, less heat's generated, less space taken up, and they're much more reliable long-term because now you're online in a closed-door environment. You're not turning it on and off and easily replacing it. So you want to be able to get rid of the pedestal PCs if you can. You can secure them, certainly, but that doesn't give you the most reliable, securable environment. You want to then, if you do have a laptop, take out the battery. You don't need it if it's going to stay in there. It just adds heat, and it affects the long-term reliability of the hardware itself. And, of course, you don't need the screen on. Again, it saves power, and it's just, again, a mechanism for getting to the desktop. It's not a desktop itself. Using small form factor switches. You don't need a 24-port switch if you're doing 3, 4, 5, or a single user. Eliminates space, eliminates power, eliminates cost. And you want to stay up to date with the latest crypto devices, like the new Nano that just came out from General Dynamics, where now it's a little bitty device where it used to be huge. Yay, finally. And even more importantly, the cost got cut in half. USB powered. Yes, exactly. So now you have a real dynamic physical security solution that can now be tailored to the technology and the hardware as it evolves to get the best performance so that security does not inhibit performance but enhances it, giving you better access and availability. And you also have to, as I mentioned before, you're going to be online for 2 or 3 years contiguously. You don't have to ever get in it, just keep it running. That's the most stable environment. Then the hardware, the tail doesn't wag the dog here. The hardware and the connectivity to the network don't dictate A, the security profile, or B, the operational environment that either limits your performance or makes security a cumbersome, complex procedure that you are going to do everything you can to subvert or to get around. You keep it simple, you keep it effective, you keep it reliable. And you also have to consider the power when you're in a facility as well. A lot of times people just say, oh, we're going to put in, because now when you miniaturize things, where before you'd have in a tall safe, you may have one big mini computer in it, you now have dozens of PCs, all quad processor and everything. You have so much usability there, it still takes up a lot of power, and you now may have 20 users available from a hardware suite, whereas before you could only do 2 or 3. So you got to have enough power to handle it. The other thing is, use the IPS containers where practical. It's not a solution for all things. If you're in an environment with, and I can give a number of places, let's say Greeley Hall at Fort Huachuca, okay, 2,500 users, okay. You're not going to get a safe on every desktop. But the point is that you can effectively decentralize the encryption and decentralize the connectivity so that you can make it more practical and more efficient. And when you use these IPS containers, as I mentioned before, they don't obsolete themselves. So whereas before you may have had a larger safe that you can now move to another location, put 3 or 4 servers in it, whereas you can then bring in a smaller safe to adequately substitute for it as the hardware gets more miniaturized and performance increases. The other important thing, I mentioned it earlier when discussing crypto keys, keep the crypto inside the safe all the time, keep it running, keep it keyed, and therefore you're less to human error. You also don't have any issues when it comes to keying and unkeying. You don't have to manage all that hardware. The last thing is that as you push the IPSs more to the access points, the most important thing is that you provide space efficiency, number one. So security is not the big elephant in the room, but you also have ease of reconfiguring and relocation. And more importantly, you also, when you decentralize things, particularly from an encryption point of view, you're not going through a single stack or a single pipe of having everything going through one comm center. And that's where it becomes a real issue of decentralizing and distributing it to get better bandwidth. So that's it. You want to have integrated network security, insiders and outsiders, and the human error threat. Consider the use of IPS containers with built-in access controls in conjunction and working alongside of cybersecurity to give you the seamless network endpoint from the user to the cloud. Close with one final quote. Wayne Gretzky was known to have said when he asked why he was the best, or supposedly the best hockey player ever, he said, "I always skate to where the puck is going, not where it's been." And that's what we need to have in the physical security world. So with that, I will take your questions, if you have any. Yes? Sure. Thank you all for coming, by the way. I appreciate it very much. Thank you. The diagram.
Yeah, that right there.
Right there, okay.
My question is about that safeguard. What company makes that device? This right here?
That is actually a server tech PDU, but our company is one that makes it into Safeguard by adding the lock and the door controls.
Okay.
Yeah.
And what about on the network Dropbox that has the patch panel?
Yes.
Is there intrusion detection for that?
That has a padlock. It's usually using the same Dropbox security.
But, I mean, we spend so much time looking at who's accessing the switch.
Hey, how do you do? Thank you for coming by. Appreciate it.
We spend a lot of time with this looking at who's accessing the switch, who's accessing the physical hardware.
Right.
But
Well,
if
you
there's
put the
just a
switch,
padlock
no,
on
but
the
you see,
patch panel,
but here's the key. If you take the desktop access control, you can turn the switch on and off remotely.
Sure.
So the tech can
And
come in,
ports,
turn
and
the switch on, and then the ports are only red when you plug into it when it's actually been activated.
Right.
Okay, otherwise, when the switch is off, first of all, the user now does not have access to the switch. And now he has access to the network only when he's authorized.
Thanks a lot.
Good questions.
Appreciate it.
Thank you for stopping by. Hi. Huh? I didn't hear you, Jinsi. I'm sorry. The noise in the background, excuse me. No. Yeah. Oh, okay. Yeah. No real change. And this is available if you wanted to get a copy of it. And the talk is also going to be on the website. So.